Today we'll be looking at Operation Barbarossa in focus, with an emphasis on the logistics, planning, and general strategy of both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army. Prior to the German invasion in June of 1941, the Red Army had actually received numerous warnings that something was awry. One Red Army sub-commander reported 32 German troop transports spotted in the entrance to the Gulf of Finland. Not to mention there was the case of the German Sergeant Major Turncoat, Alfred Lieskov, who swam across the Bug River to report the incoming attack. Meanwhile, General Maxim Perkyev informs Chief of Staff Georgy Zhukov, who informs Stalin, who unfortunately was suspicious of the claims, and Defense Commissar Semyon Timoshenko reports that the Germans had actually cut the telephone lines going into the USSR, who promptly wanted to alert the border troops. Stalin wanted to walk a middle path. He agrees to warn the military councils of the possible threat, but he didn't want to seem like he was being incited by the German provocations. And despite warnings, including those from both the English and Chinese intelligence, the Soviets were taken by near total surprise. Operation Barbarossa was said to be one of the largest invasions in human history, in which every member of the Axis Pact was to contribute men. Roughly, we are looking at 140 German infantry divisions, 13 panzer divisions, and 13 motorized divisions. First up, we have Army Group North, comprised of 26 divisions under Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, comprised of two armies under George von Kukla and Ernst Busch. Then we have Army Group Center, which is 51 divisions under Fedor von Bock, the 3rd Panzer Group under Ermann Holt, and the 2nd under Heinz Guderian. The 9th Infantry under Adolf Strauss and the 4th under Gunther von Kluge participated as well. Then we have Army Group South, in which we see 41 divisions under Gerd von Rundstedt, the 1st Panzer under Ewald von Kleist, the 6th Army under Walter von Reichenau, the 17th under Heinrich von Stupennagel, and the 11th under Eugene von Schubert. The 3rd and 4th Romanian armies would be assisting Army Group South. And it should be noted that the forces from occupied Norway, as well as allied Finnish military, were to participate as well. And here we see roughly the deployment of the Wehrmacht on the eve of war, with Army Group North obviously trying to lay siege to Leningrad, Army Group Center to take the rail center at Minsk and push on to Moscow, and Army Group South moving into the Ukraine to take Kiev, and eventually this force would come into conflict at Stalingrad. Now, on the onset of hostilities, both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army had a whole slew of logistical questions they had to face. One being was how to traverse the massive countryside within the Soviet Union, not to mention the increasingly poor roads and a rail system using a completely different gauge than that which was used in Western Europe. So, the Germans were to summon large motor vehicle pools from occupied nations, not to mention 635,000 horses employed to assist the armies. Divide between fast armored units and slow infantry groups brought up another issue: how to deal with the gaps formed from the Blitzkrieg. Now, the USSR's forces employ a large pool of manpower and resources, to be sure, 230 divisions, yet only about 170 are in Western Soviet Union. A massive trip would be required to move these manpower and resources to where they need to be, especially for those in Siberia. Now, of the 24,000 Soviet tanks, only a quarter are combat ready. German intelligence estimates only about 10,000, however. Also, the Soviets would be employing the T-34 and KV-1 heavy tanks, of which the Wehrmacht knows very little about. There are nearly 8,000 Soviet planes as well, yet many are either in disrepair or largely obsolete at this point. Now, the Blitzkrieg was said to accomplish its goals before the onset of the winter months, and before the autumn rains turned the poor Soviet roads into a slew of mud. Another pressing issue was that of General Paulus's wargame studies, which ended up showing major concerns about German capabilities to complete strategic goals. This is not even to make mention of the logistical and infrastructure issues mentioned above. Now, to focus in on the Red Army faced a number of pretty serious structural problems at the onset of warfare. Now, Stalin's purge of his officer corps had decimated his talent pool, leading to a whole slew of inexperienced commanders filling up his ranks. And despite Timoshenko's training and reorganization, the army was woefully unprepared for the onset of battle, with little logistical support for the frontier troops needed to blunt the Blitzkrieg. And, not to mention, Stalin ends up confusing command by forming a new state entities above the army. The Chief of General Staff must answer to the Stavka High Command, which itself answers to the newly formed Goko body. This means that communication between the front commanders and high command is muddled by state interference. Now, the Soviet general staff are largely to blame for really the immense failure that was the onset of Barbarossa for the Russians. For one, the frontier troops were positioned in an offensive manner near the border. It was assumed that the Wehrmacht would engage in battle only 2 weeks after the onset of hostilities, and that they would only to use a part of their forces. Their plans predicted that rapid Soviet counteroffensive could easily defeat the invaders, with no real systematic defensive planning. And of course, the result of this is that the troops on the frontier are easily encircled by the Blitzkrieg in a matter of only weeks. The vast Wehrmacht host was pretty much entirely unexpected. No Soviet defensive planning at all ends up hampering the response to Barbarossa's German offensive. And this was, of course, compounded by the logistical deficiencies, not to mention Stalin's interference and purges in his army staff. Now, the Red Army, practically speaking, had three options for defensive warfare. One would be a forward defensive line, whereby a static hard line is used to cover the entirety of the border. This, however, was inappropriate for the USSR due to its immense, large border, making armored breakthroughs very likely in certain spots. Plus, the USSR's incorporation of hostile border ethnic groups greatly hampered the security of such an idea. They could have opted for some sort of mobile defense, whereby organized tank attacks are being used to cut off invading panzer groups. This seems a bit more viable and was very popular among some of the commanders, but it is also unlikely to have worked, as current reorganization, lack of adequate officers, and failure to accurately grasp the tank organization hinders this type of response, whereas the Germans were quite adept at tank warfare, as the 1940 Blitzkrieg had shown. Now, the strategic defense in depth, that is, a series of defenses that draws invaders deep into the country, wearing them down and blunting, or even cutting off the panzer spearheads, is easily the most viable plan. Yet, unfortunately for the Red Army, this was chosen quite late, leading to enormous Red Army losses. You'll notice that historically, this was used by Peter the Great against the Swedes, and was used by Barclay de Tolly against Napoleon. So it stands as proofs that the defense in depth is very well suited to the Russian countryside. Perhaps the two men that best embodied the Soviet defensive debate was that of Alexander Svechin and, of course, Tukhachevsky. Now, Svechin encouraged a defensive planning model as alternative to the dogmatic Red Army offensive war plans, and, of course, was unfortunately marginalized by the High Army staff for his planning. Now, he essentially called a doctrine for the weaker side to defer to the defensive, and argued that land loss was acceptable for a nation as large as the USSR. Tukhachevsky, on the other hand, called for rapid mobile assaults to disrupt hostile mobilization, that is, to take the initiative in the first phase of hostilities. And this was the plan that was encouraged by Soviet superiority and high army staff. Not to mention the superiority of tanks and planes encouraged this idea on paper. Now, Svechin largely doubted the industrial capabilities of the USSR compared to other powers such as Germany, and questioned the effectiveness of Stalin's 5 year industrialization plans, and was, of course, accused of being under bourgeoisie influence. So we see that both political and Red Army politics play into the decision making here. Now, in traditional World War II academia, it has traditionally been asserted that, the Soviets had been planning all along for this defense in depth. However, this narrative largely seems false. When we take a look at the attitudes of the general staff, general troop placement, as well as Soviet assumptions about warfare, indicate a preference for forward defensive line. That is, they wish their troops to be on the frontier in a highly offensive manner rather than defensive. For example, a placement of 20 of the 29 mechanized corps, about 80% of all new tanks, and 50% of highest quality aircraft at the frontier would imply that the Soviets intended to use them to smash the enemies in a rapid counterassault. The commander of the Western Special Military District, Dmitry Pavlov, later asserted that Soviet planes had been intentionally positioned at border with no defensive consideration. Also, aerodromes so close to border that the Luftwaffe ended up destroying 800 planes on the first day. The Soviets then lose 89% of pre-war tanks after only 6 months. The terrible losses in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa are better explained in this model. The Blitzkrieg encircled and destroyed frontier troops who had been intentionally deployed in an offensive position, with little to zero regard for defensive defense in depth planning. Now, further hampering the Red Army's preparations for Operation Barbarossa was the General Staff's failed analysis of the German successes of 1940. The Soviet High Command did not really take the right lessons from the Blitzkrieg, with a review that year attributing success to extremely favorable circumstances rather than the tactical superiority and technological advancements of the Wehrmacht war machine. The Soviets end up explaining away the Wehrmacht success as some sort of anomaly, therefore maintaining their own flawed doctrine, which would come to haunt them. Now, the Germans faced plenty of challenges on their own, one of them being the modernization efforts with the focus on transport vehicles. Now, born out of being a solution to the horrific attrition of World War I, it was noted that it took over 1,500 trucks to meet the carrying capacity of one double tracked rail line. And of course, the Germans noted that personnel, fuel consumption, and repair concerns with mass production of motorization was inevitable. Low German stores of rubber and oil and other resources common to vehicles were a note of concern. Now, the Wehrmacht incorporates many civilian vehicles to meet the supply demands of the army. Now, because they're incorporating so many different types of vehicles in different contexts, there is the issue of standardization problems. And prior to the outbreak of World War II, wear and tear alone did damage to about 2,400 trucks monthly, yet only was able to replace around 1,000 monthly. German Commander Franz Halder notes that pretty obvious decrease in operational efficiency that this caused. Well, the Germans have two choices. Should they increase production of these vehicles, of transport trucks? Well, there's not enough rubber to do this with. So, civilian truck acquisition was the obvious choice for them in the situation they were in. Hitler eventually doubles the panzer divisions, which exacerbated the resource problem even more, as it therefore took even more trucks to supply them. This would cause huge problems during Operation Barbarossa, especially given the horrific road conditions as you get deeper into the USSR. Now, prior to the onset of hostilities with the USSR, the chief of German war economy, Georg Thomas, had some early concerns of his own. He noted that it would take nearly 13,000 tons of rubber a month for the operation to succeed. Germany could only produce about 7,300, so he naturally requests the capture of the Galician oil fields during Barbarossa, of which Army Chief of Staff Halder declines. Now, the fuel situation, another issue, was only enough for about 2 months of full operationally effective deployment in the east. Motor vehicles, meanwhile, would be concentrated with the panzer groups. The infantry would therefore lag behind, so the issue of gaps being left by the Blitzkrieg was still an issue. Despite the various supply and logistical concerns for both the Soviets and the Germans, Barbarossa would turn into one of the most ferocious battlefields of all time. But, as we will see, the Germans' attack would eventually stagnate into a total disaster. So, the next time, we will talk about the failure of Operation Barbarossa and the stagnation of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front.